This video is going to quickly cover emotions, stress, and health. When we look at emotions, there are three theories of emotions. James Lange is kind of the first theory, mentioned mostly for historical purposes. But the real question that they consider in creating an emotion theory is, what comes first? In the James Lange theory, he would say that what happens is that arousal causes the experience of emotion. So what that means, for example, is there's a car coming at you, your heart starts to beat fast, and then you experience fear. So it's a very cause-effect and somewhat simplistic. The next theory is the Cannon-Bard theory, and this says that the emotion and the arousal occur at the exact same time. So there's a car coming at you, your heart starts to pound, and at the exact same time you are experiencing the emotion of fear. The more current and maybe more widely accepted theory of emotion is the Schachter-Singer two-factor theory. What this says is that when there's something happening, like a car coming at you, you'll experience the arousal, like your heart pounding. At the exact same time, you will label it as, in this example, I'm afraid, and then you will experience fear. With the Schachter-Singer theory, that cognitive label is really important. And the one thing that they pointed out is that a lot of times we feel arousal, but that arousal might feel or look very similar, even though the emotion itself is very different. So excitement or intrigue or something like that might be the reason that you're feeling the arousal. Here are just some examples of what would happen with the physiological arousal, and just reminding you of the sympathetic and parasympathetic, so arousing versus calming. A couple different things to note in this chapter as well. Polygraphs, the chapter talked about polygraphs. Remember, that's kind of like the lie detector test. And what we know is that it's not actually measuring whether or not you're lying. It's actually measuring your physiological response. The spillover effect is another important term to know. And what that says is arousal fuels emotion and cognition channels it. So think about when you go for a run or something like that. What happens when you go for a run is that's arousing, that's physiologically arousing. Then when you get home, maybe somebody has messed up the house and there's stuff everywhere, and now you have to clean it up, and you find yourself kind of freaking out on them. Well, it could be that that arousal that you were already feeling kind of like got you going, and then you exploded in anger on that person. But really, it was because your body was physiologically aroused from something else. So we sort of like misattribute the cognition. I think the best example of this might even be like the show The Bachelor, Bachelorette, and things like that. What you might find is that you're super aroused because you just went on this helicopter ride, or you just climbed this mountain or something like that, and it was really awesome. And then you look at this person and you're already physiologically aroused, and then you attribute that arousal or that excitement to that person. So that's called the spillover. Paul Ekman is one of the leading researchers. When we talk about emotions, he said that there are at least 6 basic emotions that, regardless of culture, all people can kind of recognize. But he does acknowledge that there are different display rules for emotions in different cultures. Ekman said disgust, anger, fear, happiness, sadness, and surprise. Carol Izzard said that there are 10. Those are listed there as well. Don't forget about the BPS model for emotion. So looking at the biological factors, the psychological factors, and the sociocultural factors that might influence emotion as well. Facial feedback hypothesis just says that facial expressions can actually intensify your feeling of anger or happiness. So if you're like not in a good mood or something like that, what we know is that if you can just force yourself to smile, that can actually correlate with decreasing anger and increasing happiness. Again, not cause and effect. So the more that you have like that happy face or that angry face, it actually intensifies that particular emotion. The catharsis hypothesis, we've talked about this before, but with anger, catharsis means an emotional release. The catharsis hypothesis says that if we release our aggression, however we might do that, maybe playing video games, that it would relieve our aggressive urges. But what we're actually finding is that by expressing anger, it can actually increase our anger. So that wouldn't maybe be the best method for coping with anger. Couple different summarizing things tied to happiness. Feel good, do good. That just says that when people are already in a good mood, they have more of a tendency to be helpful. It actually doesn't reverse, that if they're in a bad mood, they have less of a chance. Happiness in prior experience, that's called adaptation level phenomenon, and it says our tendency to form judgments relative to a neutral level defined by our prior experience. So an example might be if you're dating somebody and they're sort of like mediocre or average, and you're like, yeah, this is pretty cool, I'm happy, this is good. And then you start dating somebody else who's actually a much better person, and what you're doing is, as you're dating this new person, you're feeling extra happy because you're comparing it to your prior experience. And in the past, it's maybe been mediocre. So that's happiness coming from your personal prior experience. There's also happiness that can be tied to others' attainments. Relative deprivation is what influences that. Relative deprivation is the perception that we are worse off relative to those whom we compare ourselves with. So an example of that might be maybe in your job or something like that. And you're like, yeah, my job's okay, but then you look at other people in your friend group or family and they're like super happy and they're making more money and they really enjoy going to work each day. What's going to happen is that's actually going to make you feel worse about yourself because you're comparing yourself to others and you're like, man, my life is crappy or my job is crappy. So that just shows us how happiness can be tied to different things. The last thing for us to look at then is stress, and we look at Hansel's general adaptation syndrome known as GAS. And what it does is it describes the general response cycle to stress. Understand that there are all different stressors that we experience in our lives, and regardless of what the stressor is, this is kind of the way that our body responds. So the first stage is alarm reaction. You can see that during that our heart rate increases, blood is diverted away from other body functions, things like that. During that alarm reaction, what that means is our body is like, okay, I have a big final to study for, I'm super stressed about that. So it kind of like mobilizes and gets ready. Then during the resistance phase, this is where our body copes with the stressor. So it remains physiologically ready. High heart rate, things like that, hormones are released, all that stuff is going on. So it's trying to fight the stressor. It's trying to keep you able to cope with whatever the stressor is. During phase 3, the exhaustion phase, obviously we hope that we don't necessarily get to that. This is where our parasympathetic nervous system kind of calms us down and brings our physiological state back to normal. The problem is we can be more vulnerable to sickness or disease or anything like that, especially if our resources have been depleted because we were in that resistance phase for too long. So the one example that I would point out here would be like final exam time in college or things like that. What we tend to see is that your body can usually get you through the end of that stressful period, but typically right after that you tend to get sick. So we do have to be really careful with ongoing stressors that we experience because otherwise your body is just always on high alert. One other thing to be aware of, there are several different types of stress, but when we talk about stress that comes from conflict, there are 3 things to note. What's called approach avoidance, and avoidance. Approach is when a choice has to be made between 2 alternatives that both look great. Like, wow, I'm so excited that I got into college. I got into UW-Madison and I got into Minnesota. Well, that's awesome. Like, that's great that you got into 2 really good schools that you're really excited to go to, but it can still create stress for you because both of them are desirable. Approach avoidance is where conflict results when there are both positives and negatives with that goal. So desirable and undesirable. So it might be like, wow, I got into Iowa and I was really excited to go there and here's all these positives, but it's also out-of-state tuition and it's further from my family and all these other things. That can also create stress. Even if you get into the college of your choice, there are also kind of like downsides to that. And then avoidance is a stressor or a stress that occurs when a choice has to be made between 2 undesirable alternatives. So let's say you got into college, but the colleges that you got into, neither one are the colleges that you actually want to go to. So that tends to create a stress for us because, again, it's not a thing that we're really interested in doing.